Imagine this. It's August 1943, and a train packed with hundreds of German prisoners of war pulls into the quiet Texas town of Hearn, a place barely reaching 10,000 residents. These men, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Corps, hardened by the North African desert, peer through the windows, bracing themselves for the worst. They had heard stories, unsettling rumors about American prison camps. Some spoke of brutal interrogations, others of execution units operating far from the eyes of Geneva Convention inspectors. What none of them expected was the suffocating Texas humidity, the endless flatlands of farmland stretching to the horizon, and the American guards who seemed strangely at ease. Camp Hearn was just one of over 500 POW camps scattered across the United States during the Second World War. Yet it stood apart for a particular reason. It was enormous. By 1945, it would hold close to 5,000 German prisoners, ranking among the largest such installations in the entire Southwest. The compound spread across 400 acres of former railroad land in the old Cotton Belt, lined with whitewashed barracks, mess halls, a hospital, and even a small chapel. The German officers arriving that summer had been thoroughly briefed by Allied authorities on the voyage across the Atlantic, yet nothing quite prepared them for what they found. Guard towers stood as expected, and barbed wire ran along the perimeter, but so did baseball fields, a canteen selling Coca-Cola, and American soldiers who appeared disinterested in vengeance. The confusion began almost instantly. Oberleutnant Heinrich Warner, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, would later describe in his diary the strange informality of the Americans. Guards chatted casually with prisoners about baseball scores as if the war were happening on another planet. The commandant gave out work assignments with the tone of a factory foreman rather than a prison warden. There were strict regulations, of course, yet the overall atmosphere was nothing like the grim propaganda images of Soviet camps they had grown up believing. One prisoner, Otto Hilgenberg, a former school teacher, vividly remembered his first meal: soft white bread, real butter, and beef stew with vegetables. At first, he assumed it was some elaborate trick, a brief taste of comfort before the real conditions began. But the true psychological experiment, one nobody had planned, came that very weekend. On Saturday afternoon, September 4th, 1943, guards announced that a select group of well-behaved prisoners could volunteer for a recreational trip. The destination, downtown Hearn, to witness an American cultural event. About 50 Germans, mostly officers and NCOs, climbed into trucks under minimal escort. They suspected a propaganda stunt, perhaps a war bond rally, where they would be displayed as defeated enemies. The trucks rumbled past cotton fields and quiet farmhouses before stopping at a dusty fairground where hundreds of locals gathered around a fenced arena lined with livestock pens. Men wearing enormous hats and tight trousers stretched and smoked near the wooden chutes. A brass band played something lively, unmistakably civilian. The Germans were directed to a reserved section of bleachers. The guards took seats nearby but seemed far more interested in the arena than in their prisoners. A loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing the first event, and then chaos erupted. A gate swung open, and a 1,000-pound bull burst into the arena with a man clinging to its back, one hand gripping a rope and the other flailing wildly. The crowd exploded in cheers. The German prisoners sat frozen, unsure what sort of combat drill they were witnessing. Sergeant Fritz Haus, a tank commander from the 21st Panzer Division, leaned forward, squinting at the dust and movement before him. The bull twisted violently, hurling dirt high into the air, while the rider jerked like a rag doll yet somehow stayed mounted. 8 seconds later, a buzzer sounded, and 2 mounted rescuers dashed in, helping the rider to safety as he waved his hat to thunderous applause. Fritz turned to his comrade and whispered in German, "Cavalry maneuver training? Watch how they extract the operative under simulated enemy fire." His companion nodded thoughtfully. The logic perfectly fitting minds trained to read everything as strategy. The next act seemed to confirm their theory. A cowboy charged across the arena on horseback, rope spinning overhead in flawless circles. He released the lasso at precisely the right moment, the loop dropping neatly over a running calf's head. The horse braced, The rope snapped tight, and in one seamless motion the cowboy leapt down, tackled the calf, and bound its legs together in under 10 seconds. The crowd roared with approval. The Germans exchanged serious looks. "Reconnaissance and capture methods," one officer muttered, pulling out the small notebook he was allowed to keep. "Observe the synchronization between man and animal. The horse maintains tension automatically, no verbal orders, clearly months of disciplined training." When the bronco riding began, their military interpretations only grew more elaborate. Wild horses kicked and twisted as riders clung desperately to their leather riggings, one hand raised high, forbidden to touch the animal or gear for balance. To the Germans, it resembled advanced cavalry conditioning meant for chaotic combat scenarios. "They're training troops to stay in control when mounts panic or equipment fails under shell fire," Captain Werner Schultz remarked thoughtfully. Several of the nearby prisoners nodded in agreement. From their perspective, it made perfect sense. The Wehrmacht had its own punishing training routines, and this appeared to be the American counterpart, just more theatrical, with a civilian crowd added for morale and spectacle. The next competition briefly puzzled them. Young women, actual civilian girls, raced their horses through cloverleaf patterns around 3 large barrels at incredible speed, leaning so sharply into turns their stirrups nearly brushed the dirt. One German lieutenant suggested it might be a reconnaissance messenger drill, teaching riders to change direction rapidly while keeping pace under pressure. Another speculated it simulated evasive maneuvers for supply routes. That teenage girls performed these supposed exercises stunned them completely, though they rationalized it as Americans involving their entire society in wartime readiness, much like the Hitler Youth back home. Then came the event the announcer called bulldogging, steer wrestling. A cowboy leaned from his galloping horse, seized a running steer by the horns, dug his boots into the dirt, and with sheer strength and leverage, twisted the animal to the ground. The entire motion lasted scarcely 5 seconds. The prisoners watched in genuine astonishment. "Anti-armor infantry tactics," someone murmured. "Training for close-quarters combat." The athletic ability was undeniable, but to them the meaning seemed obvious. A form of military training masked as public entertainment, cleverly maintaining secrecy while rallying civilian support for specialized units. What none of them yet understood was the simple truth. These weren't soldiers at all. They were ranch hands, oil field workers, farm boys, and wanderers chasing prize money, belt buckles, and the thrill of competition. The danger was real, the skill undeniable, but the motivation was beyond the German military imagination. They couldn't comprehend people willingly risking serious injury for sport, for amusement, for the sheer challenge of it. The gulf between the captured Germans and their American hosts ran far deeper than language or distance. It was a divide of worldview. Every prisoner at that rodeo had grown up in a culture where leisure followed rigid order, where physical risk required institutional permission, and where public gatherings existed only for officially approved purposes. The notion of choosing danger purely for fun didn't exist in their minds. In Germany, athletics belonged to clubs with certifications, rules, and hierarchy. Horsemanship meant either cavalry training or noble equestrian display. The thought that ordinary citizens would gather on a Saturday to watch other ordinary citizens risk broken bones and crushed ribs for a 70-filer prize and a bit of local fame, it simply didn't compute. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, a decorated pilot with 16 confirmed kills, tried explaining his rodeo theory to fellow inmates that night. "The Americans have created a decentralized training system," he proposed, sitting on his bunk as others leaned in to listen. "Instead of relying on formal academies, they weave combat readiness into everyday life. Those men we saw today are reservists, maintaining skills through competitive exercises. The cheering crowds create social pressure to perform, removing the need for strict military discipline." Several nodded. The explanation seemed logical. It accounted for the applause, the prizes, the absence of uniforms. From a strategic view, it was ingenious, keeping a trained cavalry reserve without paying for standing units. But one prisoner, a former university professor named Ernst Frumgen, conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 42, wasn't persuaded. Ernst had studied American literature and culture before the war. He had read Steinbeck, understood frontier mythology, and once seen a Buffalo Bill poster in Berlin. He offered another idea. "What if this isn't training at all?" he asked quietly. "What if Americans simply enjoy watching dangerous acts, the way we attend a football game or a boxing match?" The others stared at him as though he'd lost his mind. "Enjoy it? They're clearly getting hurt," one objected. A cowboy had limped off after a bull crushed his leg. Another left bleeding from the nose after being hurled into a fence rail. What kind of people saw that as entertainment rather than tragedy, or serious military exercise? Their confusion exposed something fundamental about the contrast between totalitarian discipline and American individualism. German life in the 1930s and 40s had been shaped entirely around collective purpose. The Hitler Youth didn't simply play games. They trained with the future in mind. Labor festivals were never about celebration. They existed to reinforce the ideology of productivity. Even art and music served the needs of the state narrative. The very notion of doing something difficult, painful, and dangerous purely because one desired to, because it made a person feel alive or linked them to a tradition of independence, was entirely alien to their worldview. In the German military mindset, personal risk was only acceptable when it benefited the collective. Defending the homeland, obeying orders, achieving strategic aims. The rodeo embodied something completely different, a declaration of personal freedom. Each cowboy climbed onto the bull by choice. No one forced them to. No one faced a court-martial for refusing. They could simply walk away at any time. But they didn't, because the challenge itself carried meaning that required no outside approval. For German soldiers taught that individual will must serve the interests of the state, this American embrace of personal danger for personal satisfaction was utterly baffling. It looked like anarchy dressed in a cowboy hat. How could a country prevail in war if its people valued personal glory more than collective discipline? And yet, here the Germans sat behind barbed wire, while these supposedly reckless cowboys lived freely outside. The contradiction was striking, and for a few prisoners, it planted the first small doubt about what their government had told them regarding America's supposed weakness and decadence. Camp Hearn operated under rules that would have seemed absurdly permissive to anyone who'd seen the conditions in European or Pacific POW camps. The Geneva Convention of 1929, signed by both the United States and Germany, required humane treatment, adequate food, proper shelter, and fair work opportunities for enlisted men, while officers were exempt from manual labor. The Americans took those commitments seriously, partly out of genuine humanitarian values, but also for practical reasons. Washington knew that thousands of U.S. soldiers were being held in German camps, and reciprocity mattered. If the U.S. mistreated its prisoners, the Wehrmacht would have every excuse to retaliate against captured Americans. Thus, Camp Hearn became a peculiar mix of prison and work camp, strict in some aspects, surprisingly relaxed in others. The daily routine began with roll call at 6 sharp. Prisoners lined up by barracks while guards counted each head, after which breakfast was served in mess halls large enough for 500 men at once. The food quality actually surpassed what many Germans had eaten during their last months in North Africa, when Rommel's supply lines had collapsed. Inmates received meat several times a week, fresh vegetables when local farms had them, and enough calories to sustain health, about 2,800 per day for laborers. The camp bakery, staffed by German POWs who'd been bakers in civilian life, produced fresh loaves and even pastries on special occasions. After breakfast, work crews departed for nearby farms and ranches. By 1943, Texas suffered a severe labor shortage. Young men were overseas, and the fields still needed tending. Cotton had to be picked, lumber cut, roads maintained. The War Department developed a system allowing local employers to hire POW labor at 80 cents per day, with the prisoners earning the same amount in camp scrip to spend at the canteen. It wasn't charity. It was necessity. Without the help of POW workers, much of rural Texas would have ground to a halt. German prisoners picked cotton beside Mexican braceros and aging farmers, felled timber in the pine forests of East Texas, and repaired irrigation lines under the relentless summer sun. Officers, exempt from such labor under the Geneva Convention, lived in an odd sort of limbo. They could attend educational lectures organized by fellow inmates, everything from English lessons to higher mathematics. Some staged theater performances, building elaborate sets in the recreation hall. Others tended small vegetable gardens behind their barracks. The camp library held over 3,000 books, many in German, donated by churches and the YMCA. There was even a camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, written and printed entirely by prisoners, though each issue passed through American censors before release. The intellectual life at Hearn rivaled that of a small college, remarkable for a wartime detention center. Security existed, but it felt informal compared to the notorious Eastern Front camps they had heard about. Guard towers encircled the grounds, and roll calls occurred regularly. Yet guards often chatted with prisoners who spoke English, talking about baseball, weather, or family back home. Escape attempts were rare. Where could they go in rural Texas, speaking only German and standing out immediately? Those who tried usually got caught within a day by local sheriffs and were brought back to face a brief stay in solitary confinement, never execution. Some later admitted they had attempted escape mostly to uphold military honor, knowing full well they would fail, but needing to prove to themselves that they had at least tried. Weekends followed the strangest routines. On Saturday afternoons, prisoners could attend film screenings in the recreation hall, mostly American westerns, which carried new significance after that first rodeo experience. Sunday mornings brought religious services led by chaplains, both Catholic and Protestant. Sunday afternoons were devoted to sports, soccer matches between barracks teams, boxing bouts, and track competitions. Sometimes American guards joined in, creating surreal scenes where captors and captives played volleyball together while war still raged across 2 oceans. The second rodeo trip took place 3 weeks later, on September 25, 1943, and this time nearly 200 prisoners volunteered to go. Word had spread throughout the camp about the supposed cavalry training exhibitions, and curiosity had reached even the most doubtful minds. The Americans, pleased that their cultural program seemed to be working, arranged extra trucks and enlarged the prisoner seating area. What camp officials didn't realize was that many German officers came armed with notebooks, sketching diagrams, and attempting to decipher what they still believed were disguised military training methods presented as local entertainment. This time, the prisoners observed everything with sharpened focus. They watched the opening ceremony as cowboys on horseback galloped around the arena, carrying the American and Texas flags in precise formation, while the national anthem echoed through the speakers. Proper military display, the Germans noted with approval. Then the rodeo secretary, a woman in her 50s wearing a white hat and turquoise jewelry, took the microphone and read the evening's program over a crackling loudspeaker. Her relaxed authority confused several of the prisoners. Why was a civilian woman directing what appeared to be combat exercises? One officer even theorized she might be a psychological operations specialist working undercover. The bareback bronc riding began next. Unlike the saddle bronc contest they had witnessed before, these riders had nothing but a leather rigging to hold on to. No saddle, no stirrups. Just strength, balance, and stubborn will against a horse intent on throwing its rider. Contestant number 7, a lanky youth who couldn't have been more than 19, drew a legendary horse called Widowmaker. The chute burst open and Widowmaker shot straight upward, landed stiff-legged, and twisted mid-air in a motion that seemed to defy physics. The boy hit the ground after 4 seconds, crashing onto his shoulder. Medics rushed in, but the cowboy waved them off, snatched his hat from the dirt, and limped away, grinning despite clear pain. That single moment stuck in the minds of several prisoners. Captain Werner Schultz, who had been so confident in his cavalry training theory, watched the injured rider high-five his friends near the chute and felt a flicker of uncertainty. What possible military purpose could exist in riding a horse bred to throw you off? True cavalry training required controlled conditions, gradual skill building, and avoiding needless injury. This looked more like organized chaos, or maybe complete chaos, with only minimal medical oversight. Schultz said nothing, but doubt had begun to take root. The tie-down roping contest, where cowboys lassoed calves and bound their legs, still looked tactical to most Germans. The precision, timing, and coordination between rider and horse seemed entirely military in nature. But then the announcer mentioned that the arena record, 7.2 seconds from start to tied calf, belonged to a rancher from Amarillo who had never worn a uniform. A rancher, a civilian. The announcer went on to explain that the man owned a few hundred head of cattle and competed simply for extra income, and because he enjoyed the sport. Sport. That word again. Professor Ernst Frumgen, the camp skeptic, leaned toward his neighbor and murmured, "I don't think these are soldiers at all." The bull riding remained both the most dramatic and the most confusing event. Massive bulls weighing close to 800 pounds bucked, twisted, and even rammed the fencing, trying to hurl their riders into the dirt. One bull named Tornado had thrown 43 riders in a row, a record the announcer shared proudly, as if the animal's victory count were something to cheer instead of a training failure. The cowboys bet on who could stay atop the bull for 8 seconds. Not 8 minutes of endurance, not 8 hours of marching, just 8 seconds of raw chaos for a $75 prize and a shiny belt buckle. The crowd's enthusiasm revealed more than words could. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, eating popcorn and shouting encouragement. Older women in Sunday dresses marked scores on folded programs. Teenage couples held hands, gasping at close calls. This wasn't a tactical review of efficiency. It was a community rejoicing in its own traditions. Slowly, the Germans began to suspect they had misread everything. The truth emerged bit by bit, through camp chatter, letters home, and finally through direct conversations with guards who eagerly explained. One such guard, a corporal named Tommy Henderson from Fort Worth, spent an entire afternoon in late October 1943 describing the history of the rodeo to an attentive group of German officers. He told them about the Old West, about cowboys driving cattle from Texas to rail depots in Kansas, and how ranch hands would compete during downtime to test their skills. He explained how these casual contests had evolved into organized events by the 1880s and 1890s, with the first official rodeo held in Prescott, Arizona, in 1888. None of it had anything to do with military instruction. It was purely about honoring cowboy traditions and testing personal skill against livestock and time. The letters that German prisoners sent home, each one read and censored by American officials, revealed how their understanding slowly evolved. Franz Burmeister, a corporal from Bavaria, wrote to his wife in November 1943, "The Americans have a strange form of amusement where men ride wild beasts for money and fame. At first we assumed it was combat training, but I have learned it is simply their custom. They seem to enjoy danger for its own sake, which explains much about how they fight." His letter was approved and sent, later intercepted by German postal authorities and preserved for historians decades afterward. Another prisoner, Ludwig Stein, wrote in a more reflective tone, "These Texans possess a frontier spirit. We Germans have lost. They value individual bravery more than collective obedience. I am beginning to understand why they resist our new order so stubbornly." Post-war interviews would add even more depth to these realizations. In 1983, German television aired a documentary about POW life in America, tracking down survivors who had been held in camps across the United States. Heinrich Werner, the Luftwaffe pilot, recalled the rodeo moment with absolute clarity even 40 years later. "When I finally realized those cowboys were not soldiers, that no one ordered them to risk their necks, that they did it for pride and small rewards, I understood that I had never really grasped what America was. We believed they were soft, undisciplined, spoiled by comfort. But a country where ordinary men willingly climb onto bulls for sport, that is no soft country. Perhaps mad, yes, but not weak." Otto Hilgenberg, the former school teacher, kept meticulous diaries throughout his captivity. His family donated them to the University of Texas Archives in 1991. One entry, dated October 17, 1943, reads, "Attended second rodeo event. My earlier conclusions about military intent now seem foolish. Spoke with Corporal Henderson, who explained these Cowboys are ranch and farm workers, not soldiers. One rider we saw works at a gas station in Waco. Another teaches high school. They compete on weekends for trophies and small cash prizes. The audience treats them as heroes, yet they are simply ordinary citizens with remarkable courage, or remarkable recklessness. I cannot decide which. Accepting the rodeo as civilian recreation rather than secret training marked a larger shift in how many prisoners began to view American society. They started to observe other habits through a different lens. The way Americans argued endlessly about baseball statistics reflected passionate individuality, not weak discipline. The fact that camp guards came from diverse origins, farm boys, city men, and immigrants with Italian or Polish grandparents, demonstrated assimilation, not social chaos. Even the casual irreverence some Americans showed toward authority seemed to embody democratic ideals rather than moral decay. Of course, not every prisoner shared this awakening. Hardline Nazi loyalists dismissed the rodeo as decadent nonsense, proof of American inferiority. They saw the injuries, the lack of strategic purpose, and the emphasis on spectacle as confirmation that America was exactly as Goebbels had portrayed it: materialistic, selfishly individualistic, and devoid of unified national will. These men counted the days until Germany's inevitable triumph would release them. Yet others, especially those who had witnessed the collapse in North Africa, began rethinking everything they believed about which side truly possessed the stronger spirit. To grasp why the rodeo had such a deep effect on them, one must compare it with how prisoners were treated elsewhere. American adherence to the Geneva Convention was not flawless. Japanese Americans still faced internment, and racial segregation touched even the POW system. Yet compared to the alternatives, it was astonishingly humane. German prisoners in U.S. custody encountered living standards that stunned them precisely because they had been prepared for cruelty. For years, Nazi propaganda had described Americans as ruthless gangsters who tortured captives. But instead, these Germans found themselves eating better than civilians back home, watching rodeos, and earning wages for labor. The numbers tell the story plainly. Of the roughly 425,000 German POWs held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 1% died in captivity, mostly from accidents, illness, or failed escape attempts. By contrast, among the approximately 3 million Soviet POWs held by Germany, nearly 58% perished from starvation, exposure, executions, or forced labor designed to kill. American prisoners in German hands fared somewhat better, with about a 1.2% death rate in standard Wehrmacht camps, though that rose sharply in the chaotic final months of 1945. Meanwhile, Americans captured by Japan suffered a mortality rate exceeding 27%, enduring torture, medical experiments, forced labor, and executions. Camp Hearn, in particular, stood as a vivid example of all the contradictions within U.S. prisoner policy. The camp operated under strict security regulations. Guards were instructed to shoot any prisoner attempting to escape, though lethal force was seldom necessary. Violations of camp rules resulted in disciplinary measures, most often solitary confinement in a designated detention barracks. Yet this same facility hosted a full orchestra of 40 prisoners performing monthly concerts, a theater group staging elaborate productions of German classics, and a broad range of educational programs, including English classes, business studies, and even vocational training. The camp hospital employed German military physicians who treated fellow prisoners and, on occasion, local civilians unable to afford private doctors during the wartime shortage of medical professionals. The work system also produced curious economic dynamics. German POWs harvesting cotton in Texas fields in 1944 earned more in camp scrip than many civilians made in Reichsmarks back home, where rationing and relentless Allied bombing had shattered the economy. They could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and even musical instruments at the camp canteen. Some men accumulated so much scrip that they commissioned local craftsmen to build custom furniture or purchased supplies to carve intricate woodworks during leisure hours. A few resourceful prisoners established small businesses: a barber shop, a tailoring service, a shoemaker's workshop. all operating with American administrative consent. It was, undeniably, imprisonment, but a version that included consumer freedom and limited economic opportunity. This relative comfort, however, brought psychological tension. Some prisoners wrestled with deep guilt. How could they watch movies or play sports while comrades perished on the Eastern Front? How could they enjoy plentiful meals while German children starved amid bombing raids? Letters from home described ruined cities, rising casualties, and worsening hunger. The gap between life in Texas and devastation in Europe produced severe mental conflict. Some denied it, others fell into depression, and a few underwent complete ideological change. Between 1943 and 1945, several inmates at Hearn attempted suicide, unable to reconcile their comfortable captivity with their duty to a collapsing homeland. The American policy of humane treatment stemmed partly from idealism, partly from strategic calculation. President Roosevelt and his military advisors genuinely believed that fair treatment of POWs demonstrated democratic principles, that Allied claims of liberty and dignity were more than slogans. Yet there were also deliberate tactical reasons. Prisoners treated decently yielded more useful intelligence, posed fewer escape risks, and could be used effectively for propaganda. Newsreels showing German POWs playing soccer or attending church in America circulated worldwide, starkly contrasting Nazi brutality reports. And always there was the factor of reciprocity. Treat German prisoners well, and perhaps Germany would do the same for captured Americans. The war ended in May 1945, but the Germans did not return home immediately. Labor shortages persisted, and under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be detained until official peace treaties were signed. Few nations were eager to send thousands of men back to a Germany left in ruins, split between Soviet and Western control. The last prisoners from Camp Hearn finally departed in late 1945 and early 1946, boarding trains to East Coast ports, and then Liberty ships bound across the Atlantic. Many returned to find their towns reduced to rubble, their families dispersed or gone, and their nation unrecognizable. The Germany they had left as confident conquerors in 1941 or 1942 had vanished. Yet something unexpected unfolded in the following decades. Some ex-prisoners kept in touch with Texas families they had met during farm work or through church programs that provided care packages. A few even returned as immigrants once restrictions eased in the 1950s, choosing to build new lives in the same land where they had once been captives. Hans Miller, who had picked cotton near Hearn as a POW, came back in 1953 with his wife and opened a bakery in Houston, using skills he had refined in the camp's bakery. Werner Schultz, the captain who once theorized about cavalry training, immigrated to Austin in 1958 and spent 23 years teaching German literature at the University of Texas. These men were a very small minority. Most former POWs had no wish to return to the sites of their imprisonment, yet their decisions spoke volumes about the unusual character of their wartime experience. In 1976, a group of ex-prisoners from Camp Hearn organized a reunion in Germany to share memories and compare recollections. More than 60 men attended, some bringing along their children and grandchildren. They exchanged stories about the rodeos, about learning English, about the blistering Texas heat and the American jazz music that drifted through the camp loudspeakers. Several noted that their time in captivity had been the safest stretch of their entire war. No battles, no Allied air raids, no Gestapo supervision. One veteran put it plainly, "I survived the war because the Americans captured me in Tunisia instead of the Russians capturing me in Stalingrad." The reunion group eventually decided to contact the town of Hearn, proposing a visit to see what remained of the camp where they had once lived behind barbed wire. That outreach unexpectedly reignited local memory. By the 1980s, Camp Hearn had faded almost completely from public awareness. The military had decommissioned the site in 1946, selling off its buildings and surplus equipment. Farmers had reclaimed the land, plowing over old barracks foundations and filling in latrines. Only a few concrete slabs remained, slowly swallowed by grass and soil. But the renewed interest from former prisoners stirred something in the town. Older residents began recalling the Germans who once worked in the fields, attended Sunday church services under guard, or shopped in town using camp-issued script. The local historical society started gathering oral testimonies and relics. A hand-carved chess set made by a prisoner, a wooden walking stick, faded snapshots of baseball games between guards and POWs. In 1982, 3 former prisoners returned to Hearn. They were elderly by then, in their 60s and 70s, accompanied by families who had long heard their stories yet never fully believed them. Local newspapers reported their visit. The men walked through the overgrown remains of Camp Hearn, trying to match faint foundations to remembered barracks. They visited farms where they had labored 4 decades earlier. And yes, they attended a rodeo, this time laughing knowingly at their younger selves who had once mistaken bull riders for cavalry trainees. One of them, Otto Hilgenberg, brought along the journals he had written during captivity and donated them to the Robertson County Historical Commission, giving historians priceless first-hand documentation. The tale of German POWs attending rodeos became a small but fascinating footnote in World War II history, occasionally resurfacing in academic studies or regional accounts. Camp Hearn itself received a state historical marker in 1986, though little physical evidence remains visible today. The larger truth, that America housed nearly 500,000 German prisoners in relative comfort while waging one of history's most devastating wars, still surprises many who assume all POW experiences were uniformly brutal. The cultural clash between German military discipline and Texas cowboy individualism stands as a perfect miniature of that broader ideological conflict. A strange, brief moment when misunderstanding gave way to insight, and enemies became unlikely students of each other's worlds. Those rodeo excursions of 1943 might seem insignificant beside the scale of the war. Millions dead, cities burning, the Holocaust advancing in mechanical horror. Yet for the men who lived through that bewilderment, who slowly grasped that Americans willingly climbed onto bulls for amusement and hometown pride, it revealed something profound. It was their first real glimpse into the spirit of the culture they had been taught to despise. The realization that American strength came not from rigid control, but from something wilder and harder to break. The unruly, defiant courage of free people who chose their own challenges. The Germans lost the war, but some won something unexpected in defeat. A kind of liberation from the ideology that had once consumed them, awakened by the sight of Texans doing utterly insane things for absolutely no practical reason at all.